Thank you, everyone. It's really a pleasure to welcome Brad to Lisbon again. So welcome to your third Web Summit now.
Yes, thank you.
How is it going so far?
So far, so good. A lot of energy, a lot of people. Thank you all for coming this afternoon.
Big crowd here. And well, I'll have some questions, and I know that people is then looking also to get your book and your signature and Caroline in the book, a very inspiring one. I'm sure everyone will appreciate a lot the thoughts and the way you inspire us to think through the era that we are going through. But I have a few questions. Let's see how this goes. When looking into your narrative, I could see four big moments, I would say, over the last years that trigger these questions and all these narrative. One was 2013, the meeting with the President Obama, and the guns will turn moment that you also described. The second one, some inflection points. One, we heard yesterday Snowden in 2013, and then in 2018 all the story around Cambridge Analytica, and then more recently all the episode in New Zealand and the impact it had in lives and the thoughts that it provoked, and lately quantum computing. So four big steps over the last decades. Do you want to share with us more about these moments, but also why they call to action?
Sure. Well, I'd offer a couple of thoughts. Caroline and I entitled our book Tools and Weapons because technology really has become both a tool and a weapon, and it's just impacting society in so many ways. I should, before I say another word, it's really important for credit to be given where credit is due. This was a joint effort. There were two of us who wrote this book, so Caroline,
you need to join now.
She did a lot of work. We did this together. When you think about the decade that we've just had, I do think one of the real inflection points in terms of how people think about technology came in 2013 with Edward Snowden. So it is, I think, timely that we're talking about this, given his talk last night. It actually is a part of the first chapter of our book. And it really awakened people to all of the data that existed about them and how governments, specifically the United States government, had access to certain parts and what it was doing with it. And it changed the relationship between the US government and the tech sector. There was a point, as I share in the book, when there was a meeting with President Obama in the White House in December of 2013. And there were about 14 of us from the tech sector, a lot of people you'd recognize. I described them in the book. And we all went around the table, and we were all pushing President Obama to reform the surveillance laws in the United States. And there was a point in the meeting when he looked around and he said, well, I hear you, but he said, I have a suspicion the guns will turn. He said, if you look around the table, all of you collectively have more data than the US government does. And the demands you're placing on the government will someday be placed on you as well. I thought it was a really interesting thing when he said it. I wrote it down in part as a result. It took 5 years for the guns to turn, if you will, but I think they did. I think that was in February of 2018 with Cambridge Analytica. And you see how the public mood, especially as it's reflected in national capitals around the world, have changed as a result. So I think in some ways those were two of the societal inflection points of the decade that is just about to end. Now, I do think it's interesting as we look to the future. There's been, I think, really interesting work done this year, really led by Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand. And most people have probably seen some of the images of her in Christchurch, in the wake of that terrible terrorist attack. And one of the things she recognized was it wasn't just another attack on another day of people in a mosque or a church or a synagogue or a store or a school. It was really the first time that the internet had been used as the stage for the attack. It was all live streamed on Facebook. It was uploaded millions of times on YouTube and other social media platforms. So she really took it upon herself, I think quite rightly, to say, how can we address this so it isn't repeated? And in the months since last March, there's been governments coming together, now 50 governments, the tech companies, to support what's called the Christchurch Call, where we are taking new steps to implement crisis incident protocols, to implement certain safeguards around live streaming. And it sort of shows part of the path forward. And I guess with quantum, I'd say, I guess we better have a path forward because computers are going to become even more powerful in the decade ahead. So all of these issues are going to become even more important.
So one of the topics that it's being approached also in many of the sessions in this summit is about data and the importance of data to, on one side, the development of the technology for the technology to a better world, and how important creating an open data community and platform can be, while on the other side, everything related with protection, with security, and with the right use of that data. So how do you see it moving forward? What needs to be done so that we get it right?
Well, what I would say is I think it's interesting to start with just thinking about the role that AI is likely to play over the next 3 decades. If you look at history, and we use history a lot in our book, what I would say is in the first half of the 20th century, one invention changed the world more than any other. It was the combustion engine. That's when it made it possible to have cars and tractors and airplanes. And of course, what fueled the combustion engine? Oil. Oil became the most valuable commodity of the first half of the 20th century. Something that literally a century before was not regarded as having any value at all. Now it's the 21st century. I think AI will play the same role between now and between now and 2050 that the combustion engine did up to 1950. What is the commodity that fuels AI? It's data. So I think data is clearly on a path, if you will, to become the most valuable commodity of our century. And it will raise a host of questions. How do we manage it? How do we ensure that it can be used by companies not just large but small? How do we protect it? How do we protect the economic aspects of it? How do we protect the privacy dimensions of it? Data is really the oil of the 21st century. As we say in the book, in some ways, maybe it's even more valuable than that. It's more like the air we breathe than the oil we burn. But it is now creating all of these new issues we need to address.
And that is also why it's so important these days, while in the past tech industry was quite apart from governments. And these days we really need to work together as we move forward, and the importance of regulation, standards, and all that needs to be done for the right use of these developments.
Well, I think this is another area where it's interesting just to study the history of technology. I don't think that there has ever been a technology that has gone as many decades being unregulated as digital technology has gone being unregulated. Whether it was the railroad or automobiles or electricity, all of the really big inventions were regulated usually by the 2nd or 3rd decade. And you could argue that we're in the 5th or 6th or 7th decade of digital technology. But I think that day is over. Around the world, you see, the boom is off the tech rose to some degree, if you will. People in government have more questions and concerns than they did 5 years ago. They have less enthusiasm than they did 5 years ago. And so I think across the tech sector, we have to start to think about how do we bring technology and governments closer together? How do we do better work to help people in government learn about technology, anticipate where it's growing, where it's going, how do we put ideas on the table about how technology can be managed? I think it will be managed whether we put ideas on the table or not, so it actually would behoove us well to be thoughtful, broad-minded, civically oriented, but ultimately proactive in offering suggestions.
You said recently that one of the most difficult chapters to write was about China. Do you want to tell us more about it?
Yeah, we have a chapter in the book about what we call the U.S.-China technology relationship, and especially when you think about AI. The United States and China are the two strongest AI powers, and there is a really complicated technology relationship between the two. I think in some ways the relationship has become somewhat strained in both capitals. And at one level, I think there's going to be hard-headed policy debates in both Washington and Beijing. It has major ramifications for companies and countries across Europe and for the European Union. I think we have to think hard about how the Western democracies protect human rights in an age of AI, how we all compete with the right kind of values in an AI world, including in an environment where AI can be used to really facilitate mass surveillance, if that is indeed considered acceptable in certain places. And I also think it just raises really important questions as well about a broader relationship. There's always going to be tensions between different countries around the world. In this era, they're going to be technology-driven. But I think we also want to live in a peaceful world. It's also a world that I think calls on all of us to understand each other better. And I think we need to make sure that we continue to ensure that software can be created by people who come together, who work together from around the world, that the basic frontiers of science and basic research can advance with people working together around the world. So there are a lot of important details that need to be thought through. And as much as anything else, that chapter is sort of a plea for people in Washington, Beijing, Brussels, and elsewhere to think about all of the issues and all of the nuances and not move too quickly to conclusions that might prove to be too simplistic over time.
When you think about the skills that will be needed for these and the next generations to come, what would be your main advice to the people that is here with us?
Well, I think there's a number of really interesting things to think about. First, it's sort of the obvious. In an economy that is driven increasingly by AI, data science and computer science will be key fields. People who have talent in data science and computer science are highly likely to find good jobs. But it's not just for those disciplines alone. I think the second thing that is interesting to think about is in an AI-driven world, software development and AI development becomes much more multidisciplinary than I think the tech sector traditionally has been. It's not just enough to design an AI system. You have to think through the ethical principles, how to apply them. And I think that probably means something of a resurgence for people from the liberal arts. Already at Microsoft, we find that people are participating in these discussions that come with degrees in philosophy or the humanities or the social sciences and the like. And I think that's actually a very positive thing because we need a multidisciplinary approach to really think through all of these issues. The other thing that I think is sort of interesting is what it means for how we organize ourselves in companies. If you look at most startups in the history of the technology industry, well, they always start out the same way. It's called a product idea. So the first goal is create a product that someone will buy. The second goal is have people who can sell it. So you end up with sort of engineering and sales. And then you have these other functions, finance, HR, legal, and the like, that people know they need. But a lot of it is, frankly, less mature than the engineering and sales functions. But in a world of AI, in a world where technology can be misused, I actually think it's going to force companies earlier in their development to mature the broader aspects of the business. It doesn't mean that they can all grow equally quickly. I mean, you still need to have the product first and the ability to sell it second. But I do think that you're going to see, regardless of what part of the world you're in, more attention paid to the so-called staff functions, if you will, at an earlier stage in business development.
So if you picture yourself with all the trends that you are seeing these days, both on technology but also in the evolution of the world, if you picture yourself in a forum like this, I would say in a decade, what do you think would be the main topics you will be discussing here?
Well, I think one of the things that is so interesting in the world today is the changes that the next generation of people are bringing into the workplace. Every generation brings its own issue, its own focus, its own desires when it comes to culture. So then you ask, okay, how is the workplace changing? Well, we have a younger generation today in every company that is less patient, and that's not a bad thing. It wants its voice to be heard. It wants its voice to be heard on big decisions that its employers make. If you look around the world today, people have much higher expectations for their employer than they did before. They really want to work for a mission-driven, purpose-driven employer. And I think that's actually forcing us all to sort of raise our game. And I think that's a positive thing. I think a second dimension is that almost every younger person, for this purpose, you pick the age younger than, you can fill in your own blank. In all probability, it is a group of people that also care deeply about sustainability issues, about climate issues. People are, they look at somebody older and say, well, you're leaving this problem to me, thank you very much. And I think that is actually making the sustainability issues for every company more important. We've traditionally said, what are governments going to require businesses to do in addressing sustainability? I think governments will be very, very important. But even in the United States, at a time when the U.S. government has been pulling away from things like the Paris Accord, employees are saying, no, you go faster, not slower. Customers are starting to say, we want to know what you're going to do. And so as I think that as we enter this decade, it's a different workplace. I think for people who lead companies, frankly, whether they're large or small, it's a more demanding job. It's also a more interesting and more fulfilling job. And I think as much as anything else, it requires new kinds of conversations inside companies and with customers. And I think that's something we're going to continue to see, at least I'll say in the first half of the next decade.
So tomorrow, Brad will be in the main stage in the morning. Any final word for this crew before we go to Tools and Weapons book?
No, the only thing I would say is, I think what it means to be part of this community is actually a lot different from what it was a decade ago when Websummit was started. This is still what it was. A place where people come to figure out how to do business, how to succeed in doing business, how to solve their very practical business problems. But these broader issues are now very much part of the conversation and part of the community as well. And if you look at what the world expects of all of us as a community, it actually expects us to do a lot more than we did before. And the only way we can do that is, frankly, to find new ways to work together. That's what I'll talk a little bit about tomorrow. It's what keeps me coming back every year to Websummit. It's what keeps me really excited about working in the tech sector. There's a lot of people who started in the tech sector when I did, a quarter of a century ago, who succeeded and then retired. I keep coming back because I love the issues we get to work on. I just think if you want to have an impact on the world, there are very few places where you can have the impact that we get to have, but the key is to have it together, and the key is to use events like this to find that common ground where we can do more together.
It's no doubt an exciting time where we can really make a difference with the decisions we take.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you all for coming.